Well, we begin the tribulation tonight. Revelation chapter 6 is going to be our text. I was thinking as I was preparing this week of all that's taken place in the last 120 years. Now, I haven't been around for all 120 years. Nobody in here has been here for the whole 120 years. Ordinarily, if John was not busy with his mother and he were here, I would tease him about being there for the whole 120, but he's not here, so I'll leave him alone. But we've seen a great deal of it. Throughout most of our lives, we can remember cell phones being invented and color TV and microwaves and, push-button phones. That was an incredible thing. We always had a remote for our TV. When I was growing up, when we finally got a TV, it was me. My dad would tell me, go put it on channel 3 or 12 or 13 because that was all you got, those three. I remember when Fox came around, we had 24. We had a whole new channel. But then, more important than that, is we've had countless wars across the globe during those last 120 years. We've seen World War I, we've seen World War II. Here recently, on Sunday, we had World War III. Thankfully, that one was quicker. That's how it was promoted. That was a joke. And then, Vietnam, Korea, and that's just the American side. You look at all the other countries across the world and the wars that they've had that have taken place there. There's been times that promise peace, and then we've seen world peace for very briefly. And people were hopeful during those times that it would last, but then we would have another world war. Pandemics we've seen that have taken place over the last 120 years, most recently, even COVID to some extent. But if you read anything about it, far more devastating than COVID was the Spanish flu that took between 50 and 100 million lives in the early 1900s. Then even years before, bubonic plague and so many other things. There have just been cataclysmic natural disasters that have taken place. 1900, Galveston just nearly wiped off the face of the earth. Other events that have taken place, we all remember New Orleans not too long ago that was just devastated with that hurricane and the flood. And then earthquakes, volcanoes, over and on 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 and on. We've had dictators that have killed millions of people. Stalin, Mao, and so many others that have just killed their own citizens. And that's just some of the events that have taken place over the last 120 years. And if you imagine all of those things and you combine that 120 years into just 7 years, you begin to get just a very small inkling of what the tribulation period is going to be like. It's just a glimpse, though. It's nowhere near as devastating as what the world is going to see when the tribulation begins. In the Olivet Discourse, Jesus compares the wars and the pandemics and the disasters and the persecutions that have happened throughout all of history as Braxton Hicks. It's just the beginning of the birthing pains. But then the tribulation period, especially the last 3.5 years of the tribulation period, is going to be what would be hard labor. So tonight we begin the study of the tribulation, and that's the bulk of the book of Revelation. Chapter 6 through chapter 18. And we see into the future, the end of human history. There will be a period of 7 years during which God will just unleash His wrath against this world and its people. And it's that time period that John got to see unfold in symbols and realities that we want to study together as we go through this book. Now, before we get into the specifics of the book of Revelation and here in the tribulation period, let me remind you just of the structure of the book. Jesus' word to John in Revelation chapter 1 and verse number 19 provide our outline that we've showed you before, where he says, therefore write the things which you have seen, the things which are, and the things which take place after these things. And that's the framework of the outline of the book of Revelation. And that's the outline that we followed and that I suggested. The things which you have seen, that's the setting of Jesus' prophecy. and that's chapter 1. The things which are, that's the state of Jesus' church. That's chapters 2 and 3, the letters to the churches. And then the things which will take place, the stages of Jesus' final triumph, that's chapters 4 through chapter 22. Now, let me break down for you just that third part, the things which will take place after these things, the stages of Jesus' final triumph that we're going to see here. And we've so far studied chapters 4 and 5, which is the Lamb and the seven-sealed scroll. The next major section, the one that we will be in tonight, would be the 7-year tribulation that we begin tonight. And that runs all the way through chapter 18. Now, let me fill out that 7-year tribulation period for you. I'm not going to go through these in detail. Don't be alarmed. This is what we're going to be studying over the next 8 years. In chapter 6, that was me and Emily. You don't get my jokes at all tonight. In chapter 6, you have the first 6 seals, which is where we'll start tonight. Then in chapter 7, there's an interlude where we look at the tribulation saints. I won't get ahead. You'll see. Then in chapters 8 and 9, you have the 7th seal, the first 6 trumpets. And then there's another interlude where we learn about a little book and the 2 great witnesses. And that's in chapters 10, verse 1, all the way through 11, verse 14. Then in 11, verses 15 through 19, through the rest of 11, we have the 7th trumpet. Chapter 12 through 14, there's another interlude in which we learn about a war that takes place in heaven. The beast and the false prophet. And then announcements from heaven that we see there. Chapters 15 and 16, the 7 bowl judgments that we'll see. And then 17 and 18, the destruction of Babylon. Both its religion and its business. So that's an overview of these chapters that articulates and details the 7-year tribulation period that's yet to come. We're going to march through them together, so we don't have to go into detail tonight. But that's sort of the 30,000-foot view, if you will, of the forest that we're going to go. So you have the Lamb and the seven-sealed scroll in chapters 4 and 5. You have the 7-year tribulation in chapters 6 through 18. And then chapter 19 is the second coming. There you go. I was going to say, it's that next slide that I gave you. The second coming in chapter 19, the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and the millennium in chapter 20, verses 1 through 6. The final rebellion in chapter 20, verses 7 through 20. That one's amazing to me. The great white throne judgment in chapter 20, verses 11 through 15. And then the eternal state in chapters 21 and chapter 22. And then, of course, chapter 22 ends with an epilogue, beginning in verse number 6, which we're called to respond to what we've read in the book there. So you can see that as this unfolds, not only a logical, but a chronological order. And we'll see as we walk through this together what it is. And so that's an overview of the study that we're going to have together. And don't panic, I'm going to quit on time regardless of how far we get tonight. I knew when I started this I was not going to cover all 4 seals, even though I gave them to Stephanie, and she's feverishly typing them in now. From Revelation chapter 6 through 18, we're going to learn about this coming period that we call the tribulation. Now, before we get into the details of it, again, let's look at this period that is the tribulation. First of all, the English word tribulation comes from the Latin word tribulum. That's an agricultural tool, word for a tool that separates the chaff from the grain. What they would do is they would take a heavy board and then they would put sharp objects on the bottom of the board, usually nails and rocks and things like that. And then they would sit on top of the board, heavy weights and things, and they would drag that heavy board with those sharp pieces and those weights on top of it, across the grain of it, and they would separate the real grain from the husk. And so that was kind of the process of what they do, and that would be the tribulum. The process was called the tribulotio in Latin. In Greek, the word is thlipsis. Sorry, it's a theta. But anyway, For tribulation, it means literally a pressing together. So you can see where it came from. That's the idea of a tribulum, where something was pressed under a heavy weight. And when the Greek word for thlipsis or tribulation is used, it's always used in the study of last things. It refers to future events, what we're looking at. It's used this way 5 times in the New Testament. Let me give them to you. Matthew 24, verse 21, Jesus says in the Olivet Discourse, "For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will." And then in verse number 29 of the same chapter, he said, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days," and then he talks about the signs that we see in the heavens. In Mark chapter 13 and verse number 19, again is another reference. By the way, this is Mark's version of the Olivet Discourse. It's a parallel passage, if you will. It's a harmony of the Gospels. Verse 19, he says, "Those days will be a time of tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of creation, which God created until now and never will." So it's a unique time in human history and how God deals with humanity. And also Mark chapter 13 and verse number 24, "In those days after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light." And then Revelation chapter 7 and verse number 14, "I said to him, 'My Lord, you know,'" who these people are, "and he said, 'These are the ones who came out of the great tribulation, and they washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb.'" So notice in every one of those cases, the event that Jesus was speaking about was the future in His time, and it's still future in our time, unless we completely redefine the signs in the heavens, because we have not seen the sun darken, the moon not giving its light, and the powers of the heavens shaken, and the stars fallen. None of that has taken place yet. So unless you've seen those things, it's still in the future. And there are other reasons, by the way, that it's future. I just mentioned that one. Now, a couple of times, the adjective great is added before the word tribulation. Great tribulation. You'll notice in Matthew 24 that we read that the word falls before it. A great tribulation. Revelation chapter 7 and verse number 14 that we read, the Great Tribulation. Now, the Great Tribulation refers not to the entire 7-year period, but rather to the last half of the tribulation. The reason that I say that is in Matthew 24, Jesus describes an event called the abomination of desolation. And we'll talk about that at some point. We will get to that. But it's when the Antichrist sets feet in the temple, and he offers an alternate object of worship there in the temple in Jerusalem, which of course is himself, and that's called the abomination of desolation. Daniel chapter 9 and verse number 27 puts that event at the midpoint of the book of the 7 years of the tribulation period. And again, we will get to Daniel as well. I'm going to give you a list of scriptures here in a bit that all relate to this, that you can go read. The reason I say that in the Matthew 24, Jesus describes an event called the which is the midpoint. We see this in Matthew 24:21. Here's that verse. "For then," that is either after the abomination of desolation, which is the midpoint, "there will be a great tribulation such as not occurred." So after the midpoint, the abomination, when Antichrist enters the temple in Jerusalem, offers himself as God to be worshipped, we see the great tribulation take place. And here's an overview. If you don't like charts, Jared, turn your head. You can ignore this. But if it helps, I've drawn one up for you there. I did put cloud sunset in there. I couldn't remember that I did that. And then I saw it out of the corner of my eye and I said, oh no, I did do that. If it helps, there you go. On the left side, we have the rapture of the church. I left a gap there. We don't know how long that's going to be. I think personally it could be a short period. It could be a longer period of time. We don't know. A lot of people think that's what begins the tribulation period. It is not. The peace treaty that is signed with Israel that's supposed to last is when the tribulation period begins. We will get into that also as we go along. Then it goes all the way through to when the Lord comes back. Notice I put in the middle there the abomination of desolation, and the midway point, 3.5 years, and then the great tribulations. And that's where seals 6 and 7 are open that we're going to study. The first 4 seals we're going to hopefully get into tonight. Probably we might get one in. And then we have an overlap of the 5th seal that carries over into the Great Tribulation as well. But we will cover those as we get there. So the whole 7-year period is the tribulation, the abomination of desolation, when the Antichrist sets up himself to be worshipped in the temple, marks the midway point, and then that begins the Great Tribulation. And it's not called the Great Tribulation because it's different in character than the rest of the tribulation, or the first half, but because it will be much more intense than what we see in the first 3.5 years. All of it is tribulation. Even the first 3.5 years is tribulation. It is not a cakewalk in the first 3.5 years. You're going to see that shortly. But the second half will be great. So after tonight and probably next week, it's hard to even imagine something that's worse in light of what we're going to study that's going to take place in the first half. Just to give you some descriptive terms of this period from the human perspective, it's called birth pangs. It's called the day of trouble, the time of Jacob's trouble, the day of distress, the day of darkness and gloom and clouds. And from the divine perspective, this period of time is called the day of the Lord, the day of vengeance, the day of punishment, the day of destruction, the day of judgment, the day of the Lord's anger, and the day of wrath, or of the Lord's wrath. You can tell quickly the tenor of these times that lay ahead. Here are some key passages. This isn't all of them, of course, but some key passages that as we study these chapters, we're going to be referencing, and we'll go to them and take a look at them. You have in the Old Testament, Daniel chapter 9, and that's the prophecy of the 70th week in chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. Daniel also comes back to this time of trouble in chapter 12, in verse number 1. In Zephaniah chapter 1 and Zechariah chapters 12 through 14. And when we come to the New Testament in the Olivet Discourse, and by the way, in case you don't know what the Olivet Discourse means, that's near the end of Jesus' earthly ministry, before he is going to die on Calvary. He delivered a message to his disciples on the Mount of Olives and looking over the temple, and they had just gloried in it. And then he told them that the temple would be destroyed. There wouldn't be any brick left on top of another, no stone left on top of the other. And they asked him in response to that, what are the signs of your coming? And he delivers what we call the Olivet Discourse because it was preached on the Mount of Olives. And he talks about the future, and he talks about the tribulation and the second coming. And so in both Matthew's version, in Matthew chapter 24, and Mark's version, which is Mark chapter 13, we learn about this event. You can put with that 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 1 through 3, and also 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And then, of course, especially Revelation chapter 6 through chapters 18. Now, let me show you the focus of this time, because I don't want you to lose your focus as we go through this. What is this time period about? And there's a lot of moving parts, different characters, and a lot of things going on. But what's the tribulation about? Let me show you this. Turn chapter 6. You should be already there. We're going to look at verse number 15. We're not going to get to that tonight, but I'll go ahead and read it to you. This is the 6th seal that the Lord willing we'll get to next week. But verse number 15. Then the kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders and the rich and the strong and every slave and free man hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. So you get the idea. Every human being on earth, so they hid themselves in the rocks and the mountains. And then they said to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. Now notice verse 17. This is the tenor of the Great Tribulation. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Now flip over to chapter 11, verse number 17. And it says there, verse number 17, saying, we give you thanks, O Lord God, the Almighty, who are and who were, because you have taken your great power and have begun to reign. And the nations were enraged, and your wrath came, and the time came for the dead to be judged, and the time to reward your bondservants and the prophets and the saints, and those who fear your name, the small and the great, and to destroy those who destroy the earth. Now let's look at chapter 14 and verse number 10, speaking of those who worship the beast and his image. Verse number 10 says, he will also drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger. And he will be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. They have no rest, day and night, those who worship the beast and his image and receives his mark. Verse 14, you see this image of a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like a son of man, having a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. So that's our Lord. It's a picture of our Lord. And another angel came out of the temple, crying out with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe. Then he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. And another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. Then another angel, the one who has power over fire, came out from the altar, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, put in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe. Where's this going? Verse number 19. So the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of earth. These are human beings. And threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. Look at chapter 15, verse 1. I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous. 7 angels who had 7 plagues, which are the last, because in them the wrath of God is finished. So in these things, the wrath of God is displayed and finished. Verse 7, the one of the 4 living beasts gave to the 7 angels 7 bowls full of the wrath of God who lives forever and ever. Chapter 16, verse number 1. I heard a loud voice from the temple saying to the 7 angels, go and pour out on the earth the 7 bowls of the wrath of God. Down to verse 19. The great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. And then lastly, chapter 19, this is the second coming. Verse number 15, speaking about our Lord, where it says, from his mouth comes a sharp sword, so that with it he may strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron, and he treads the winepress of the fierce wrath of God the Almighty. Did you catch a theme going on through those verses as we read them? The wrath of God. I think you can see from those verses what the focus of the tribulation period is. It's not about what the beast is doing, or the false prophet, what the false prophet is doing, or what the nations are doing to Christians, or what the nations are doing to Israel. It's not about the 144,000 or all the other things that are sidetracked. The point of the tribulation is what God is doing. It is the unleashing of his wrath and the wrath of his Lamb against this rebellious world that we live in. So with that background, let's go back to chapter 6. We're going to begin reading in verse number 1. If you would stand with me, and we'll go ahead and read our text. I'm going to go ahead and read the first 8 verses, though I don't think that we'll get to all of them tonight. Beginning in verse number 1. Then I saw when the Lamb broke one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying, as with a voice of thunder, "Come." I looked, and behold, a white horse, and the one who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. And when he broke the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature saying, "Come." And another, a red horse, went out, and to him who sat on it, it was granted to take peace from the earth, and that people would kill one another, and a large sword was given to him. When he broke the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature saying, "Come." I looked, and behold, a black horse, and the one who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard something like a voice in the center of the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine." When the Lamb broke the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature saying, "Come." I looked, and behold, an ashen horse, and the one who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following with him. Authority was given to them over 1/4 of the earth to kill with sword and famine and plague, and by the wild animals of the earth. We'll stop there. Thank you. You can be seated. In the verses I just read to you and the rest of chapter 6, Jesus Christ initiates the devastating judgments of the 7-year tribulation period, and He does so by breaking the seals of the scroll. You remember last week that we looked at the scroll that was in the Father's hands, and the Lamb had taken it from the Father's hands, and on that scroll were 7 seals that were sealed across the edge of the scroll. And you remember that that scroll was the title deed to the earth that the Lamb received from God the Father. The first 4 of those seals, the ones that we just read together, occur in the first half of the 7-year tribulation period. The 5th, as I said before, has an overlap between the 2 periods, and then the 6th and 7th seal are what we would call the Great Tribulation, or what Jesus called. Which would also contain the 7 trumpets and 7 bowl judgments, describe events that happened in the second half of the tribulation period. And the 7 seals that we're going to study together here in Revelation parallel the judgments that our Lord describes in His Olivet Discourse in Matthew chapter 24 and Mark chapter 13. So let's look at these seals together. Verse number 1, the first seal, the Antichrist's false peace. Verse 1 and 2, John watches as the Lamb, first of all, breaks the first seal. And in verse number 1, the first thing we're exposed to is the first seal and the summons that comes with it. Verse 1, then I saw the Lamb broke one of the 7 seals. Now, remember the context. Back in chapter 4, as we said, we were ushered into the throne room of God. He's given this scroll, the title deed to the earth. And then we see that in chapter 5, that He takes it to the hall of heaven, and all of creation worships Him when the Father gives it to Him. And then in chapter 6, the Lamb then, having taken the scroll, begins to break one by one the 7 seals that secure it. In verse 1 of chapter 6, John is allowed to be an eyewitness and watch as the Lamb breaks that first seal. And can you imagine the scene? Can you imagine the eagerness and the anticipation to learn what could be in this scroll and what happens as He unrolls it? So verse 1, when the Lamb breaks one of the 7 seals, I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying as with the voice of thunder, "Come." So we see the summons. Now, the first 4 seals, the ones that I read a moment ago that we're going to study, share certain features in common. First of all, each of them is accompanied by a summons from one of the living beings, the single word "come." Remember, a few weeks ago, the 4 living creatures around the throne, we studied them together. They're angelic beings, and in the case of each of these, there's a summons by one of them to come, by one of the four living beings. And in each case, that summons is followed by the appearance of a colored horse with its riders, and these four seals are unique in that way. In other words, these first four are distinct from the other seals, and they belong together. These first four seals with the four horses and the four riders are, as you know, are commonly referred to as the four horsemen of the apocalypse. In the Olivet Discourse, Jesus places events that parallel these four seals into the first half of the tribulation. And so that's how we know that that's where they belong. Now, as soon as Jesus broke the first seal, verse 1 tells us that John heard one of the four living beings, those majestic angelic beings around the very throne of God, issue a summons and says, "Come," with a voice like a clap of thunder. For those of you who are literature fans, it's interesting that the Greek word for thunder in this context is bronte. Do with that what you will. But thunder, some of you are looking at me like very puzzled. I'll give you a hint. There were three sisters in there that wrote. Y'all need to read more. Now,
I was just thinking of the town here in San Angelo.
That's Bront. Wuthering Heights. These three sisters wrote a lot of books that y'all are familiar with. Their last name was Bronte. But anyway. Some argue that summons here, that's way off the point. The summons here is a call, it's written for John to come. Come and see. We see that in the book of Revelation. Come see what's going to happen. Some argue that it's for Christ to come. But clearly as this unfolds, the summons is to the horsemen themselves, one after another. So in response to the first living creature saying, "Come," in response to that command, you have the appearance of the first horse, verse number 2. "I looked and behold a white horse, and behold," points out the fact that it was alarming, that John was taken aback and he was startled by what he saw. The first horse was pure white. Now, the color of the other horses, as we'll see, have significance because of the color of the horse. And so this one likely does as well. White in the book of Revelation, as you know, stands for and symbolizes righteousness. However, the rider of this horse clearly represents the forces of evil. So this isn't about real righteousness. It has to be a counterfeit righteousness. What this horse and its rider represents gives every appearance of being outwardly godly, right, just, and desirable. That's the first horse. And then we're introduced to the first rider in verse number 2. "And he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer." Now, there's been a lot of debate about the identity of the first horseman of the apocalypse. Some have suggested the identity of the rider was the Roman emperor of the time. Others, a personification of judgment. Some even said that it's a representation of God's Word. I don't know how they come to that conclusion. Or the victorious course of the gospel message. Some have taken it to mean that. Some have even said that it must be Christ. Now, you can think about why they would argue that it would be Christ, because in chapter 19, we see there that Christ also is seen on a white horse. But that rider wears a victor's wreath when he comes. Stephanos. He carries a bow, but the one in chapter 19 is crowned with many diadems. And the diadems have a sharp sword that comes from his mouth. So totally different picture. So I can understand why they would say that it was Jesus. And as we'll see, more to the point, it's clear that the other horses and their riders, they're not persons, but rather they're forces. They are events that unfold. They're not literal people. And it's best to take the first one in the same way as the others as they come. So this horse and its rider, just like the other three, personifies something that is happening on the earth. This particular one comes with the beginning of the tribulation, verse number 2. And he who sat on it had a bow. Now, you understand that a bow was traditionally associated in the Old Testament and the New Testament with a warrior. But did you notice what's missing in what he's carrying? Bow and, thank you, there's no arrows mentioned in here at all. The bow implies the threat of war, but the absence of arrows implies that the war never occurs. Instead, there's a bloodless victory, apparently accomplished through peaceful means. Verse 2 goes on to say, and a crown was given to him. Was given is passive. It's what the theologians would call the divine passive. In other words, he receives his authority, this crown, only by permission of God himself. In fact, the verb used here, was given, only occurs in Revelation about divine permission. That he was allowed. He was given permission by God the Father. So the point here is everything that says the seals are broken, even though it represents evil being done in the earth, it's under the authority of God, accomplishing the agency of the Lamb, doing what God would have for it to be done. It says a crown was given to him and he went out conquering and to conquer. He is victorious. He gains more victories, but those victories don't come at the cost of arrows or the use of arrows, instead through treaties and other peaceful means. Conquering implies a career marked with many victories. It's ongoing, a series, a string of victories that occur. Conquering one after another after another. And to conquer means literally that he might conquer. That's his goal, that's his aim, that he has conquered. His life has been a series of conquering, and that his continued goal is to conquer more. It is to subdue this planet under his authority with an overwhelming victory. So this picture here of the first horseman of the apocalypse is a picture of a rapidly expanding kingdom accomplished not through actual bloody war, but rather through treaties and diplomacy. In other words, this horse and its rider pictures the false peace that the Antichrist will orchestrate. If you look at parallel text, especially in Daniel chapter 9, you discover that the Antichrist will accomplish his worldwide expansion of his rule, not through battles and not through wars that he's going to fight, but through treaties and covenants and agreements. He's loved and adored and cherished, and he's the one that finally brings peace. I mean, I was talking about the last 120 years. Just look back through your lifetime. Has Israel ever been at peace since 1958? No. It's been constantly over and over and over again. And here even just recently, the rest of the world in that area is constantly at war with one another. The nations in the continent of Africa are constantly battling one another. There's wars and rumors of war and leaders posturing and doing all the things that they do. Well, this man comes in and he is able to establish for the first time continued peace, and a treaty is signed. And then another treaty is signed. And another treaty is signed. And he conquers the world, but he does so through peaceful means and through signing treaties. And that's the very beginning of the tribulation period, when that treaty is signed with the nation of Israel. So the Antichrist does this for the most part without bloodshed. And it's a kingdom that promises world peace. I mean, what should be better than world peace? But it's a charade. It's a false peace, and we'll quickly learn with the second seal, which we have time for. The second seal, verse 3 and 4, titled War. Again, as Christ breaks the seal, there is a summons. Look at verse 3. When he broke the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, "Come." So just as with the first seal, when Christ breaks the second seal, John hears the second living creature around the throne calling out for the horse and its rider, "Come." And then we're introduced to the second horse. Verse 4, and another, a red horse, in response to the summons going out. This color of this horse is a fiery red. This horse brings civil war, war between countries, and even world war. And that becomes very clear when we learn about the second rider, verse number 4. And it goes on to say, "And to him who sat on it, it was granted to take peace from the earth." So at the very beginning of the tribulation period, there will be a promise of world peace under a new world leader who is a charismatic individual who will accomplish his victories not by warfare but by treaties and covenants. And his purpose is to bring the entire world under his control, and he will do so successfully, offering peace. But that peace is quickly shattered by the next horseman. Verse number 4 says, "It was granted," again, by God, is the one who is doing the granting, "that this horse and its rider should take peace from the earth." So the second horseman of the apocalypse, shortly into the 7-year tribulation period, ushers in a worldwide conflict. This second horse and its rider symbolizes violent bloodshed and the horrors that accompany war. There's an outward temporary peace ushered in by the first rider, but it quickly proves to be a false peace, and it's a cheap imitation for the everlasting peace that the Prince of Peace will someday bring. Verse 4, notice he says, peace is going to be taken from the earth, that's worldwide. And then verse 4 says, "And that men would slay one another." Here's where we learn how peace will be destroyed, by slaying one another. The Greek word translated slay is a broad word that includes all violent acts of taking life in war. In other words, when Christ breaks this seal, it will result in unspeakable carnage and war across the face of the earth. Verse 4 says, "And a great sword was given to him." So this horse and its rider were given the sword that the Roman soldiers carried into battle. That's the Greek word that was used there. And it symbolizes a conflict, a violent death. There has always been war on this planet, and there's wars raging today. But the second horseman of the apocalypse will usher in a time of unparalleled war. Unlike World War I and World War II, which were not truly worldwide, this one will be. And then the third seal will move quickly. There is hope. Verse 5, "Then he broke the third seal. I heard the third living creature saying, 'Come.'" So again, in response to the summons, the third living creature, John saw the third horse. Verse 5, "I looked and behold a black horse." The black color of this horse implies, obviously, darkness, but the concept of grief and mourning. Why? Well, we'll discover why when we meet the third rider. Verse 5 goes on to say, "And he who sat on this black horse had a pair of scales in his hand." So the rider holds a bar with scales suspended on it on both ends. In other words, the ancient tool for weighing food. And we'll see, and you've all seen pictures of them, the old-timey scales and stuff. If you're rich and you weigh your gold, perhaps you have one. Everybody's laughing, so I guess nobody does. Verse 6 says, "And I heard something like a voice in the center of the 4 living creatures." So at this point, John hears another announcement. It doesn't come from one of the 4 living creatures. Instead, notice it's like a voice. I don't know what it was. I can tell you it wasn't a voice, but it was like one. It comes from the center of the 4 living creatures. Now back in chapter 5, verse number 6, we learned that at the center of the 4 living creatures was, does anybody remember? The throne of God. They were surrounding the throne of God. So this is the voice of God Himself, and God speaks these words, and it's a reminder that all of this is unfolding in His sovereign purpose and plan. Now, notice what God says about this horse and its rider, verse 6. It says, "Saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius." Excuse me. Now let's take that apart a bit. Those are obviously ancient terms, and when I read that, none of y'all go, "Oh, okay." But first of all, the Greek word that in our version translated as a quart is a dry measure similar to a quart. It's actually, our quart is slightly more than what the ancient Greek measurement would be. But just so you understand that Greek word, it's close enough to a quart. So I think quart's a good translation. So think of a dry measure, a quart jar. Wheat was the primary food of the ancient world. It was a better quality grain. It was more expensive than barley. And a quart of wheat that's described here was the amount that it was understood one person needed every day to sustain life. A quart of wheat is what you would eat in a day. So 1 quart, 1 person, 1 day is the amount of food. A denarius was the average worker. That's what he earned in a day. So think about this. The price caused by the famine will require a full day's pay to purchase enough wheat for just one person. Normally in the first century, a denarius would have bought 10 quarts of wheat. This is a massive famine, and God the Father goes on to say, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. Barley was the cheaper grain. In fact, it was often the grain that was fed to the animals, but poor people also ate it regularly. But here we're told that a common worker is going to have to work an entire day to provide just enough food to provide for a family of 3. There's no extra money for anything else, just enough money to get food to get you through that day. Normally, by the way, in the first century, the same amount of money would have bought 30 quarts of barley instead of just 3. So you can see that this famine has created incredible inflation. You thought the inflation we've seen since COVID has been bad. This is incredible inflation. So this writer symbolizes then the scarcity of food caused by a famine. Doesn't that make perfect sense though? If the food is scarce, then the supply is low. And because the supply is low, the demand is high. And so the price, supply and demand, we all know how it works. It drives the prices up. And the resulting inflation in this context means that most people will barely have enough food to survive. They're just scraping by. The common people will have to work just to feed their families and have nothing left over when it's done. Then God adds in verse number 6, and do not damage the oil and the wine. Oil and wine were often associated with the rich in the culture. So this may mean that the poor are just struggling just to survive, just to eat, but the wealthy will see very little impact, very little interruption to their life. Robert Thomas writes in his commentary about this expression, the privileged lifestyle of the rich remains completely intact. Now that's one possible interpretation of that. And there are others who think that the oil and the wine, these important commodities, will be so hard to come by that they will need to be carefully protected. And that's the idea here. Make sure you don't damage your oil and wine. You need to make sure you take care of those 2 precious commodities. Regardless of that last expression, what we see in this 3rd horseman of the apocalypse is the most severe worldwide famine that has ever struck the globe. Then the 4th seal. We're going to go quick. Verse 7, when the Lamb broke the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4 living creatures saying, come. So again, in response to the command to come, we meet the 4th horse. Verse 8, I looked and behold an ashen horse. Now, the Greek word for ashen here, xloros, is actually the word from which we get chloros, is where we get our English word chlorophyll. It describes something pale green. Your translation may say pale, ashen is New American Standard. We see others. But here it's really, the word means a pale, sickly, yellow-green color. It's the color of a corpse in a decomposing state, in decay. That's the color of this horse, and that's certainly appropriate in light of the rider. that we meet in verse number 8. And he who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following with him. So the rider and the horse personify death in all its forms, and it's accompanied by Hades. Now we looked at this word when we were back in chapter 1 and verse number 18. Hades is used in two different ways in the New Testament. Sometimes it refers to the place of conscience punishment where the wicked go after death, or hell would be the word we would use. Other times, as here, it's used for the state of death that both believers and unbelievers enter when life is over. In other words, the grave. That would be another way to say it. And I think that's the idea that we see here. You have death accompanied by the grave. Verse number 8 says, authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth. That is unbelievable, that God will give this horse and its rider authority to kill one-fourth of the world's population. Now think about that for a moment. Currently, the world's population stands at 8 billion people. If 1/4 of 8 billion people died, it would mean 2 billion people would perish in a very short period of time. Just to give you an idea of how many people that is, it would be as if suddenly every person living in India and every person living in China died suddenly. They just went away. Now with this fourth seal, a fourth of those who had survived the carnage of war that we saw with the second horse, who survived the decimation of the famines that took place with the third horse, a fourth of those still alive will die. Many have already died, but those remaining, a fourth will die. Nothing like this has ever happened in human history before. Death and Hades will be given authority, notice verse number 8, to kill with the sword and with famine and with pestilence and by the wild beasts of the earth. So death comes in 4 ways with this seal. The sword, of course. That's that two-edged sword that we are familiar with. Famine. The famine that began with the third seal will only grow worse and more will die. Pestilence, that's disease, will be rampant and fatal. Think about it in today's world. With 2 billion people suddenly die, there would be no way to process those deaths. You cannot bury 2 billion people. You cannot incinerate 2 billion corpses. There is no time to even take place for it. And the only thing that separates us from the beasts, the wild beasts of the field, they're separated from us because they have a fear of us until they get hungry. And with this famine that's taken place, the wild animals will not fear men anymore because they also will be affected by the famine. So this fourth seal, when you think about it, we've already had worldwide war that's taken place. We've already had famine that has taken place. That people had to work all day just to get enough to eat for that day and nothing else. And some will have undoubtedly died through that. And now on top of that, a fourth of those who survived will die. So moving on. What are the lessons for us? I'm just going to read these for you real quick, because I don't want to leave without lessons. Number 1, you will personally have to face the Lamb, heaven's Lord. Don't think about the person sitting next to you. Don't think about it theoretically. Think about this personally. You will face the Lamb. And you have to face Him in one of 2 ways. Revelation's clear in that. You will either fall before the Lamb and worship Him because of His redemption of you, or you will flee from the Lamb in terror because of His wrath. Those are your only 2 options. I have some text that I wrote down there for you, and I'll just give those to you and let you read those, and won't comment. I don't have time. The second lesson is God is patient, delays His wrath, but He's also just, and wrath is coming. God has given people every opportunity. He's called them. His Holy Spirit has called them to Him. Ephesians 5:6, let no one deceive you with empty words. Because of these things, the wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience. God is loving. God is patient. But He's also just. It is coming. Thirdly, and I love this, and we will cover this in greater detail later, but you don't need to fear because Jesus our Lord has promised to rescue us from the wrath to come. And I am going to read these verses. Romans chapter 5, verse number 9. Much more then, having now been justified by His blood, we will be saved from the wrath of God through Him. And 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 10 says, wait for His Son from heaven, whom He has raised from the dead, that is Jesus, who rescues us from the wrath to come. That includes the great tribulation. It's coming. It's going to happen. But Christian, it's not anything that we have to fear. We will cover rapture and timeline, all of that. I already gave you a chart tonight. But I'll give you opposing views of that. But God, Christian, you're not destined for God's wrath. He's rescued you from God's wrath. So all the things that we read about, we don't have to fear. But it ought to ignite our hearts to share the gospel with those that we love, so that they also don't have to face the wrath of God. Because it is coming. Let's pray.